Good evening, fellow Rotarians and guests. Welcome to our second leadership training series organized by the District Training Committee. This evening, we're addressing the topic of unboxing toxic behavior. And I know it's a topic that not is openly addressed, but it does exist. And this conversation will be led by the accomplished Cavelle Joseph St-Omer. I hope I got her pronunciation right, from Trinidad and Tobago, who we'll formally introduce later on. Permit me to acknowledge the presence of our esteemed District Governor, Leslie Ramdani from Grenada. Thank you, DG, for joining us. I know you're struggling to navigate around your virtual visits to the clubs. Happy that you were able to take time out to be here with us. Immediate past District Governor Sonia from Barbados, the lady who was on fire last year as our District Governor, and obviously is still burning based on the images coming out of Baltimore, is also with us this evening. And this conversation was really started by her last year, and I was really encouraged by her to continue it this year. To all our district leadership on the call, we're happy that you're able to join us. District Membership Officer Audley, if you're here, hello. I know that you were intrigued by the topic. I wish to also extend a special welcome to PP Kimberly from the Rotary Club of Georgetown, who is the newest member of our District Training Committee. And she will be the voice of Rotary on our committee. A special shout out to all the special guests who have joined us this evening. I'm Liz Cox from the Rotary Club of Garden City, Georgetown, Guyana, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. To start us off as usual, I'd like to invite our District Governor, Leslie Ramdani, to share some brief opening remarks, and he will be followed by IPDG Sonia, who will also share some brief remarks, especially about the topic. DG, the frame is yours.
Good evening, District Trainers. Thank you for the introduction. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening, having accepted the invitation from our district training team as they present this webinar on the topic unboxing toxic behavior. This is a subject that is very relevant to us as we imagine Rotary this year, focusing on the main priority of our President Jennifer, where we are endeavoring to cultivate clubs where members are always welcome and where we embrace and exemplify DEI. Exploring this evening's topic will certainly reveal that it is a characteristic that, if not harnessed, will affect our ability to adopt the DEI strategy in our clubs. So I do welcome everyone, and I look forward to an evening's informative presentation from Mrs. Cavelle Joseph St-Omer. Thank you all for joining. Thank you.
Thank you, DG. IPDG Sonia, please take the frame.
Thank you so much, District Trainer Liz, DG Leslie, fellow Rotarians from District 7030, but I must shout out the Rotarians from all around the world. I'm seeing special faces as well. Yinka, welcome to District 7030. Great to have you back here with us. And all you other Rotarians from Ghana, the Gambia, Nigeria. Oh my goodness, this is overwhelming. So I'm so happy to see everyone here. And as Liz said, this conversation continues from last year. So often we, male and female, do things that are not really the right thing, and we don't know. We don't realize that we are being inappropriate in our actions, subtly, but in all other ways. And I know Cavelle is going to definitely deep dive into this evening, but this conversation continues and puts us in a frame of mind where we really are our brother's keeper. And as we move forward, as in imagining Rotary, we have a responsibility to ensure that our actions as Rotarians with ourselves and our colleagues, our Rotaractors and interactors are on that level, that we know we're doing the best that we can do and being absolutely and completely above board. So I look forward to the discussion. It really is going to be a great evening. And I look forward to the questions and answers later. Thank you so much for having me here this evening, Liz.
Thank you, District Governor Leslie, as well as IPDG Sonia, for those kind words, and I'm sure very encouraging words that we're hearing from our leadership team here. At this point, I'd like to invite PP AB from Trinidad to introduce our guest speaker. AB, over to you.
Thank you, Liz. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to provide a brief insight into our presenter this afternoon. Ms. Cavelle Joseph St-Omer. She is a globally recognized human resources executive with 20 years of experience. Her passion is providing human resource solutions for her colleagues and clients by helping them build their human resource infrastructure through technology, compliance, and people. No stranger to speaking at international forums, Ms. Joseph St-Omer was a panelist at the Carib HR Forum 2021 virtual conference in Jamaica. Prior to becoming president of HRMAT in 2019, Ms. Joseph St-Omer presented at HRMAT's 12th biannual conference on the topic of human resources and human rights in the workplace. She was invited to speak at Women of World First International Women's Day Conference held in Barbados in 2018. And in 2016, Ms. Joseph St-Omer was a keynote speaker at the opening of the World HRD Congress 24th Annual Conference in Mumbai, India. Cavelle is a sought-after presenter and has shared center stage with her knowledge and experience at several locally organized forums. Ms. Joseph St-Omer is a member of the Board of Directors of the National Training Agency.
I don't think that I'm going to.
She is presently the Public Relations Officer at the Arthur Lockjack Graduate School of Business Alumni Board and Director of the Epoch Foundation. She is the holder of a Master's of Business Administration with distinction, specializing in Human Resources Management, a Bachelor's of Science degree in Economics and Law, double major, and earned her international certification with the Society for Human Resource Management at the SRHM Senior Certified as SHRM Senior Certified Professional. Members of District 7030 and visiting districts, let's extend a warm virtual welcome to our presenter for this evening, Ms. Cavelle Joseph St-Omer.
Thank you so much, Abraham, for that introduction. And of course, I really wish to thank Liz for inviting me to facilitate this session with you this evening. So I will commence by, of course, sharing my screen. So let me do this right away. Everyone should be able to see this, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. And I found the topic rather interesting, but one that is actually quite relevant in terms of unboxing toxic behavior. Recognizing more and more when you listen to people talk, even when they share a bit about their workspaces in current context, you often hear the word toxic, this work environment toxic, the people toxic, you know, and what precisely does that mean, toxic? So today, some of the objectives would be really to identify the indicators of what can be considered a toxic environment, whether it is an organization such as Rotary, which is of course founded in volunteerism and giving back, whether it's a workspace, whether it's a home, in school, in churches, places of worship. What exactly is it? How could we identify it? Recognize some of the signs and symptoms of toxic leadership, because it happens across all institutions where leaders are accused now more than ever of being very toxic in their behaviors. Identify the impact of those behaviors on individuals and the institutions that these individuals are part of, and of course, consider some of the solutions, because there are solutions to every issue, right? So toxic. I mean, when you hear about toxic chemicals, you think of death automatically, poisonous, something that impacts the whole. And often we've heard one bad apple spoils the whole bunch, right? So that in itself, that saying is a signal to us that when there is some level of behaviors or what, again, the word toxic, when you describe someone as being toxic, it has the potential to poison the whole system, the whole organization, just by those negative behaviors or what should I say, behaviors that are deemed to be offensive, right? The impact it has on organizations and institutions is severe. So we're not talking about the people themselves. So when we say somebody's toxic, really what we're saying is the behaviors that they exhibit is negative, is offensive, is dangerous to the institutions that they serve. And that's essentially what you can gather or understand by the word toxic, right? Now, what does a toxic organization look like? And really and truly, when you do have toxic leaders at the helm of organizations, it has the potential for derailing the institution's objectives and achieving the ability of those institutions to achieve their goals. It impacts the ability of people who serve these organizations to really deliver and be of their best selves, you know. At the end of the day, decisions are being made and it's often tend to be driven out of fear. We often hear about leaders who are myopic, leaders who are narcissistic. We hear often these words describe individuals and what is the direct consequences of leaders who exhibit those traits that are so aptly described. It often leads to decisions that are being made and not necessarily being made in the interest of the organization that these individuals serve. Then, of course, with toxic behaviors, organizations tend to have high levels of dissatisfaction and high levels of stress because no one is actually absolutely satisfied with working in an environment that they're not comfortable with or they're unhappy in. So that level of dissatisfaction and the whole concept of one bad apple spoiling the entire bunch means that the minute you have unhappy people in your organization, and even when you welcome, as the Rotary Club does, welcome new members from time to time, just like when I engage in recruitment and selection of new employees, and we do have people who are unhappy and disgruntled and are not satisfied with the leadership of the organization, even when you have good talent coming in, people who can serve and serve well, by the time they interact with individuals like that, it often ends up being that new individuals are impacted by the environment that they've just entered in. And therefore, that in itself breeds a deep level of dissatisfaction that impacts an organization negatively. Often when we have toxic environments as well, there's a wastage of the resources because the time you take, the effort and time, just like in my job as an HR practitioner, whenever I have to now take time out of my day, which is actually quite often, to now mediate issues and to discuss issues and sit with managers and employees who are having conflict in the workspace. The time that I take to do that it could have been spent differently, you know, a little bit more productive, because it results in me spending time having to deal with these issues and address the issues. Then when people leave the organization as a consequence of the negativity that they face, again, resources now have to be put into getting new hirees, to recruiting, to selecting, and there's a cost associated with that. It's the same for your club, your Rotary Club. The cost associated when people leave the Rotary Club for one reason or the other to get new recruits who would understand the Rotary way and live by the Rotary principles. That is time wasted that could have been utilized differently. And of course, for interpersonal relationships, I mean, we'd all want to be members of organizations where we could actually network, work well with each other, that out of this interaction, opportunities arise as well. And I'm certain that occurs in the Rotary Club as well, where some of you would have gotten business out of your interactions of doing good work, meeting each other, knowing each other, business and all sorts of opportunities arise. So all these things in terms of a toxic environment and having toxic people around, it's impacted very negatively and it results in some of these outcomes. So what are the signs and you know, what have you identified, even not necessarily only within the Rotary, but in any organization or institution you've been a part of? What are some of the key signs of a toxic environment? Often we've heard leaders abuse power. We hear it at the political level, we hear it at the organizational level, you hear it even in religious institutions where people, when they have positions of authority, often abuse it, right? There's some level of inequality in terms of how people feel in terms of decision making, in terms of how resources are allocated, in terms of opportunities provided to members. Inequity and inequality is often heard. There's often negativity in terms of the outlook. Oftentimes you hear, and you see it in some organizations where people never have anything positive to say. Something is always gloomy, and you hear it even in national discourse. We just had a budget, for example, right, in Trinidad and Tobago, and the whole discourse is centered mainly around the negativity around it in terms of some of the measures that had to be introduced in this cycle. And in terms of the opportunities that were discussed, little is being shared about that, because oftentimes people tend to have a very negative outlook on things. Poor communication, lack of trust, unhealthy relationships, and boundaries. We've often heard the word boundaries, and boundaries in terms of people's physical space, boundaries in terms of the language that is used and often tested. Now, in the world of work, you hear industrial language, and in some environments that is accepted. They would tell you in construction that is acceptable construction language. But for some people, boundaries are crossed when certain conversations are had in front of them in their presence, or when obscene language, as an example, is being used in their presence, and they feel offended by it as well. So these are some of the signs and much more. Where a lack of respect, when people don't respect each other, or their views, where people talk over each other, you're not given an opportunity to express yourself. These are some of the signs that you are in fact in a toxic environment. And we've often heard it, especially when people say that they feel like they're part of a minority group, or they are a minority in a situation like that. When we look behind that, the messaging behind that is exactly what we're discussing here this evening. That the environment has become one where there are parts or portions or sections or groups of people or cohorts of people that feel that they don't belong, or they don't have the opportunity to contribute to their organization in a meaningful way. So some of the behaviors that you may see exhibited would be things like selfishness. And sometimes leaders are accused of being selfish. We're hearing that more now than ever, especially with social media justice. And people are now using their platforms to air their views. So we live in a time where information is provided very freely. And selfishness in terms of decisions being made to favor the few. We often hear leaders and organizations, even governments, being accused of that. Open hostility, and sometimes this hostility is reflected in language, and sometimes even it becomes physical sometimes as well too, from someone nudging or bumping into each other or to a person deliberately, right? Or someone basically talking down to someone else in a meeting space, right? But there are signs of open hostility, and often we've described it as a hostile work environment where someone can no longer contribute or produce in a positive way because the environment is such that it doesn't allow for that, and the environment is hostile towards them. And in the world of HR, people have left organizations on the basis of it being a hostile environment. And that has serious consequences for those said organizations that have been accused of being hostile, because employees thereafter, or past employees thereafter, actually have strong industrial relations cases before the court, where the courts have upheld that this person was actually forced out of the organization because the environment had become so hostile. Manipulation. And we see it in all different contexts where sometimes you're made to feel guilty for some of the decisions that you had to take. Or sometimes people manipulate others to get favored positions or favored roles or opportunities to travel, or opportunities to serve on committees, etc. Manipulation is key, is at the heart of some of the toxic behaviors that we see. There's high degree of argumentativeness, and there's some people we know, I mean, I'm certain you've come across them, where they could always tell you how you can't do something, why you can't do something. They're very argumentative. They generally don't agree on much, right? And arrogance with decision making, and even harassment. And harassment in particular requires some special emphasis, because harassment takes you into several different types of harassment that is extremely toxic, from sexual harassment to bullying to cyberbullying, right? These are some elements of harassment that exist that is definitely detrimental to organizations and institutions such as Rotary International. And not because it's a volunteer organization means that the form of toxic behaviors that I've just described doesn't exist. It's wherever people are, because people are the center of it all, and all the things that I've described here are behaviors demonstrated by individuals. So the same challenges you find within the workspace, where people come together in the interest of producing a good or service that you bring to market, the same way people now in a volunteer organization come together to serve the mandate of that organization in a capacity where they are not being paid or they're not earning for it, an income because of it. But the behaviors are associated with the humans that come together to work together, who are socialized very differently. And as a consequence of that, there are clashes in personalities that result in behaviors such as what has been described. So as we focus a bit on harassment, what are some of the things that could be deemed to be harassment that you may have even experienced yourself, but didn't know that it could be described as harassment? From the offensive jokes, and we know the jokes, some people tend to pass things off as jokes, even when they're actually being quite serious in terms of what they're saying. They tend to pass it, oh gosh, I'm just joking with you. But most of the time, they're absolutely serious about what they've said. And some jokes take on a sexual connotation. Some jokes impact or could be deemed what we say discriminatory, because it impacts whether it's how you look, your size, your beauty, all sorts of things, right? It's a description that may impact you in terms of describing you physically as well. So jokes are one that is described and is recognized in law and in cases as being deeply offensive and as a form of harassment. There are also slurs, and we know that in the past, at least, we've tried to get certain words out of our vocabulary. Even now, we're hearing this whole thing about being politically correct and political directness, and whether or not we're taking it too far because of the movements that have evolved, especially out of the United States, the Me Too, the Black Lives Matters, and all the other movements that have arisen. But there was a time where slurs and how you would describe particular groups of people, whether it's people from an Asian background or of African descent or of East Indian descent, but they are in fact offensive. And over time, even how we describe people who are differently abled and the words used to describe them, some of those things are no longer accepted by society, especially one that has evolved to such a level of social consciousness that we're seeing now, that you can no longer get away with what you may have said a couple of years ago, right? And that connects to name calling as well too. And there are times when people actually give you a nickname and they think it's a joke. I recall in my early career, people used to call me the union leader coming, you know, Errol McLeod. I was called Errol McLeod in one organization because people felt I raised issues around the employees too often. But I know that was meant to insult me and my work that I was doing, but I was never detracted from my purpose in that organization. But name calling is definitely a form of harassment, and it's meant to have a particular impact and effect on you that impacts the overall performance and your contributions to the organization that you're serving. Then sometimes some get deeper in terms of being physical. And examined and sat and worked on several cases where harassment took the form of, and in some of the cases that I looked at, the gentleman actually pinched the woman on her bottom, right? That actually occurred. One touched a woman on her breast. These things actually occurred, and then threatened that if you were to report this matter, I will ensure that you're fired, or I will ensure that you lose your job, or I would withhold an opportunity for you to be promoted, right? So sometimes it enters into the physical assault arena, and the measure of protection that is given to you or support to your organization becomes absolutely critical at that point in time, especially if organizations only power, like an organization such as Rotary, the main power you may have would be to possibly expel someone from the Rotary Club. But when it becomes physical, then it becomes an offense in law that takes it into a different realm as well too, where the Rotary Club may actually have a responsibility to assist this person with reporting the matter to the relevant authorities as well. Offensive pictures, and even now with WhatsApp groups, and it connects to emails and WhatsApp as well. So people think, again, it's funny to send across videos and you know, things that have pornographic material in it, or jokes, or memes, because memes took on a whole life of its own, especially during COVID. And some of these things are deeply offensive. And I'm certain if Rotary Club, if you all have your groups, your WhatsApp groups, there should be guidance and rules that govern how we interact with each other in those WhatsApp groups as well, to ensure that at the end of the day, the focus of those groups are about the work or the purpose, which in this case would be the Rotary purpose in terms of sharing information and updates to members, etc., and not necessarily for the jokes and things of a sexual nature, for example. So now, because of social media and even the ability to connect with someone on social platforms like Facebook and Instagram and all of that, don't think for a second that because you sent it on Facebook or you sent it on Instagram, that it doesn't impact the institutions that you're part of, whether it's a place of work. And then don't think that it cannot be investigated, because that is a platform that you've utilized. More and more cases through social media activities and social media behaviors, companies have taken action against individuals, even for things that was not done on the company's platform. So I want you to bear that in mind as well. And maybe some of the rules governing your organization could expand, if it doesn't already, into that realm, because it does shift. It does shift to the online platforms. And if you have members within the Rotary Club who interact with each other on social media platforms and they're being offensive towards that person, then investigations and looking into the matters and those behaviors could take on a different spin, although it occurred on social media. But the arms, in terms of executing discipline and all of that, it has those far-reaching consequences, especially if it's documented in your policies and procedures or guidelines or code of ethics or code of conduct. And I'm certain that you all have these documents in place. Now, in terms of the type of harassment, I gave an example of a few before. We discussed sexual already. We discussed verbal, and then there's a psychological. When somebody consistently tell you that you're no good, that you're a non-performer, that we didn't really want you in this club, you know, things like that, that plays on your psyche. It happens in the workspace as well. There's digital harassment, which connects to the social media that I'm talking about as well, where someone consistently WhatsApp you to the point that you even have to block them. Thankfully, some of these apps, you could block persons, but what people fail to realize that it's also evidence, because once you could demonstrate and print out some of these WhatsApp conversations, it actually becomes evidence of someone's behavior against or towards another person. Right? So there's a digital element and the digital world that has taken on a whole life of its own. And we are also seeing the deep consequences for it, because more and more, even with young people, you're seeing people committing suicide because they were harassed on social media, right? Or they were encouraged to commit suicide because of the behaviors or the cheering on or the impact, the mental impact, the psychological impact of that kind of behavior and bullying that takes place online, right? Quid pro quo. Now, again, that word has a both positive and negative connotation to it. Quid pro quo. I use it in my volunteer world where I would say, okay, if you could assist me with this, I could assist you with this, right? That's the positive element of it. So then there is a negative element of it where one person says, if you were to perform this act for me, whether it's sexual or non-sexual, right? If you should go out on a date with me, if you should do X, Y, and Z for me, I will ensure that you gain this. So I would ensure that you get promoted. I would recommend you. I will vote for you to be president next time around, right? These things are real, and that's what quid pro quo is do this for me, and I will do this for you. And it is deeply offensive when you're being asked, or you know that you've earned something in the right way, and somebody is saying to you that I would only be willing to do this for you if you were to provide me with a sexual favor, you were to fulfill a sexual fantasy, or whatever the act may be in terms of what you must fulfill. Right? So that's a deep-rooted one, and the courts recognize that even in the definition of sexual harassment in particular as one category of sexual harassment. And of course, there's the bullying, and we see in bullying not only in the physical spaces in person, but we are seeing online bullying and taunting as well. And then through the use of third parties. So whether it's a group of people outside your home, or a group of person, or you're sending someone to deliver a message and all of that, these are types of harassments. If it's experienced in any institution, it should be squashed immediately because it has serious negative consequences, and serious in a time where there's already a war for good talent, right? There's already a war for resources. There's competition for resources. So you don't want to be losing good members who could actually bring sponsorship to the institution, such as Rotary Club, or can help sell tickets, or who actually is very strategic in their thinking, right? You wouldn't want to lose members over behaviors such as this. And some of the effects now. So you may find members not turning up for meetings, not coming out for events, not supporting events. And if you pay particular attention to human behavior, I am certain one day to recognize, if you observe someone sufficiently well enough, that someone behaves a particular way around a particular individual when we're in a space together. I could tell you personally, I've experienced this, right? Where if anyone paid attention to me, there was a particular leader that I was harassed by. And every time that person entered the room, I exited the room. If the person was on one side, I went to the opposite side. And if anyone watched me for a while, they would have noticed that. That is some of the effects of a toxic environment, where it makes you so uncomfortable that you're not even able to stay in a space and socialize properly because you don't even want to be in the same space with that person. So sickness and the consistent amount of sick leave, especially if it's a direct person you're reporting to, right? And you just don't want to be in the office, not turning up for meetings, narcissistic leadership. Of course, we hear this word a lot. It became actually quite popular under Donald Trump's tenure as president of the United States, the word. But again, is where the leader now believes they're always right. They have the best solution. They have all the answers. They're the greatest and best at everything. And everything is centered around them, right? There's little or no enthusiasm for the work. And that in itself is a sad thing. That in itself should not be even encouraged, because you want people joyously wanting to contribute to the mandate of the Rotary Club or your organization. For those of you who have businesses or working or are still employed and contributing in other organizations, you want people to come to work and they're happy and they want to give up their best, right? But when you have a toxic environment, that is definitely not possible. Communication is impacted, high turnover, you're losing members or you're losing staff. And then the gossip and the rumor mongering and all of that. Those are things that should never be encouraged in any environment at all. Because again, how does that make the party on the receiving end feel alienated, not a part of something? They would definitely want to leave, right? So why will we now know that these things are occurring and support it when clearly the jury is out in terms of the consequences for it? So there's a dark side even to virtuous organizations like the Rotary Club. There's a dark side even to institutions, religious institutions, that on the face of it, oh, we have the four-way test of whether or not, it is true, if how it makes a person feel. There's so many things and principles of integrity and values that we stand for, and that is written and it's coded. But then it's not real in substance. It's only words, because the people who are supposed to live by these actions and give it life are actually not displaying it as well. So that's the dark side. Also, in the dark side of organization is the attacks and the scapegoating and the denials and the disbelief on relationship, and the level of intimidation that people face as well too. People are afraid to speak up. People are afraid to say what is happening. And we see it more and more when you look at what happened with Fox many years ago. And if you've ever seen the movie based on it, where so much people were silenced until one person had the courage to speak up, and then more people come out. And you see it more and more in terms of when leaders, the downfall of a lot of leaders across the globe. The minute you hear one person is brave enough and they speak up, more and more people come out and say, yes, I've experienced this too. And because most of the time when it happens, that is not the first instance of it, because it's a pattern of behavior with that individual. So it is not surprising when you hear 5, 6, 7 women, even now with the Adam, for those of you into music, and Maroon 5, I love that band, by the way, with Adam and his current situation with a young 21-year-old girl. She came out, she had the WhatsApp messages, because he did message her, all right? So she had the screenshots of that. And then you have 5 other women talk about it after, because it just takes one person to have the courage to empower others who've experienced this before. And most of the time we say, well, why didn't you say something how long ago? Why didn't you speak up a long time ago? But when you have a leader that is beloved, which often happens, you have a singer who everybody appreciates their music, right? Who is going to believe, let alone me, that this person is actually being like this? And oftentimes these leaders and these people who we admire are very charismatic, tend to be genuinely liked, but nobody knows the dark side of that person's personality. And it takes a lot of courage to speak up. So that is why you would say, okay, let us believe it, or at least let us investigate it rather than sweeping it under the rug, right? So investigate, because I'm also saying too, and I will say too, that there are cases that the accusations were false, right? So that is why the investigative process, and in terms of how you deal with disciplinary issues as a club, it must be strong enough so that you give everyone an opportunity or a good hearing as well. Whenever behaviors like this, you hear members are being accused of behaviors such as this. And there's a cost to all of this. It's been through SHRM. SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, has estimated the cost at $44 billion in terms of resignations because of these kind of behaviors, toxic cultures, harassment, and all of that. Because all of that is, everything I've described is lumped under toxic behaviors, toxic cultures. It's $1 billion problem. And whether we like it or not, if you were to quantify it over time, when you look at people who have left some departments and you see the signs of it, sometimes you're not paying attention, but the signs are there. When you see a high turnover of people, high attrition in one department or in one section of an organization, sometimes you have to look to see what the challenge is with the leader. People, it's often said that people don't quit the organization, they quit the leader, right? And that in itself has, it has some merit in it. So some departments, high turnover, and then the others, people enjoy and love working with their managers. So it's $1 billion problem. Every time you have to go out there and look for talent in a time where so many people competing for the best of the best, right? So the war on talent, as I've said earlier. Then the consequence in terms of productivity every time someone joins and have to learn and have to be oriented, there's a learning curve associated with it. So there's productive time that is lost while that person is learning the organization. There's time lost when the person have left, people have left, and you need someone to actually fill in and get the job done in their absence, double up and triple up as the case may be. Then it costs twice Gallup, and Gallup research said that the cost is twice the employee's annual salary. I just have salary there, but it's annual salary, right? In terms of what it costs organizations who actually are okay with it, and not say okay, but they're not prepared to do the work to shift the culture, the negative impact on a person's career. And we know this. We've seen it with athletes all the time when they're accused of things. Up to recently with Boston Celtics, I like basketball, right? And the coach, after getting his team to the finals, the NBA finals, to now have broken the code of conduct by engaging in a relationship that was in breach of the code of conduct for the club, the team, right? That has an impact on his career at this point in time, because after getting your team to the finals, and you should be celebrating, this is his team, he's suspended for this entire season, whether or not you think that is harsh or not, but the team is quite clear in terms of the behaviors that they will accept, and that is a clear message to others who may be thinking about it, doing it, to hear what, check yourselves. And that is why the consequences are so critical to enforcing the behaviors that you want to see in your organization, such as Rotary Club. You must have consequences so that others looking on will know, here what, let us abide by the code, right? So in terms of the leadership and again, the fact that toxic leaders can be very much effective at what they do. And I recall with one sexual harassment case that I had to investigate, and it wasn't even an organization that I worked with. It was someone who reached out to me in my capacity, being involved in HR, and she heard an interview I did, and she reached out to me, and I went to her organization and I assisted her with her case. And I could tell you, in that organization, they were more concerned about that manager because he was the top sales manager in that organization, and she was just a receptionist. And I say just a receptionist because that is exactly how they described her. So her worth was less to the organization. He was valued more because he brought in income, right? So they could be very effective at their jobs, at the role. So you may have a very good member of your club who is good at networking, bringing in funds, fundraising, getting things done for the organization, but bad when it comes to human relations, the reputation of the club, and the consequences that we've just spoken about as well, right? So where you sit or stand on these issues that we've talked about would be telling in terms of whether or not you're true to your values, to what the mission of the club is, what the mission of any organization is. What we accept and what we write is two different things. It's good to have things on a nice document, a good plaque on the wall, but do we live it, right? And followers on that toxic leader may be in for the long ride. And most of the time, when that person is in a position of power and authority, people accept their behaviors because they want to be associated with a leader, and there's some benefit to that association. So they turn a blind eye to the behaviors. So do we really want to be that person that turn a blind eye, that person that is okay to sacrifice a few because I personally benefit by my relationship with this individual? You have to ask yourself that, on which side of the fence you want to stand, right? Now, we know we can't all be everybody's saviors and champions, but we certainly should not be accepting things that go against the codes, the things that we've sworn and when we became members of, or when we decided to join an organization and we signed on to the policies and procedures of that organization. We certainly want to live it and not just let it be words, right? So in terms of solutions, because we don't only want to talk about problems, but definitely the solutions. And we need to redirect or refocus or harness the aggression. So there are some people you could absolutely save from themselves, and there are some people you have to separate from the organization. So it depends on the degree of the behaviors that we're talking about. I shared with Liz when we spoke about this subject in our initial conversation that I did work with a CEO in the past who was accused of being very touchy-feely. And I learned of this from a session that I participated in, but I sat at the back of that session and people actually forgot that I was in the room and started to talk very freely with the facilitator about this particular CEO, forgetting the head of HR was there. And then when I got up at the end of it, everybody was shocked. And I said, don't worry, there's no need to be concerned. I will address the matter in such a way that it does not come back to any individual saying that they said X, Y, and Z. And what I did based on what they shared was introduce training into the organization on the subject matter. And I invited that CEO to open it because the person that was selected to lead the discussion was someone that he absolutely respected, right? And because of that session and his eyes opening up with new information and new knowledge, the behaviors change. That is where we talk about redirecting or presenting new information, training, leading, just like the session that you're doing today, because sometimes some people are not aware that their behaviors are offensive. So it's through training, we get an understanding here what I need to improve on this area. That also impacts the culture of the organization as well. Culture is enforced or reinforced or impacted by rules and policies. The laws of a country impact culture, for example. The rules and policies and procedures of organizations impact culture as well. And through the consequences, where there's absolutely some kind of penalty associated with the behaviors, that also helps shape a culture, because then people are now required to conform or face consequences, right? So you have to develop strategies around that person, whether you isolate that person, whether you separate from them altogether, whether you retreat, whatever the strategy is, it must be there in terms of addressing the matter. You must be prepared to address the matter, right? The organization's leaders and executives must also buy in. The support must be from the top down. Most of the time you find in organizations, it's the most junior people they send on some of these programs. And when they go back, they are more informed, but the people who absolutely need that information, who influence decisions, who shape policies, who assign funding, all these different things, they are not exposed. And therefore, as a consequence of that, no real change occurs. So who we select to even go on training opportunities to get the information that could actually make a difference to your organization is also critical. And it should start from the top so that it could be resourced in such a way and supported in such a way that change could actually occur and happen, right? We need to recognize that we ought not to be empowering toxic people. So we shouldn't facilitate their behaviors. Yes, they make a little stupid, they make a little joke. And at the end of the day, we all laugh and they feel supported by it. And they say, yeah, you're cheering them on. So toxic people, toxic leaders, do not empower them. And again, we owe it to ourselves not to become that toxic person ourselves, right? So recognize when our behaviors are offensive. And even if somebody says that to you, and they said, this is how you made me feel, it's not up to us to say, no, you didn't really feel that way. Or I didn't really say that you taking that so seriously. If somebody says you offended me, then you accept that. That is how they felt. You may not have felt the joke or the behavior or the touch was that offensive, or it was an actual compliment, you know, someone who absolutely always complimenting on a woman's physical attributes, for example, and she's always offended by it. And she says to you, hear what, I'd prefer you not comment about how I look today. That is how she feels. So respect that. Don't say, well, it's a big deal. A man can't play a woman a compliment in these times or what. And I'm using this example, but I want all of you to recognize that women are also offensive too. And there are also same-sex cases as well. So I don't want it to seem like I'm just picking on the men as well, right? We've seen cases where it's same-sex, and we've also seen cases where the women are actually offensive as well. I've had a friend who for Carnival was deeply offended when a number of women kept grabbing him in his private area, right? Was deeply offended by it. So again, we have to examine our behaviors and ensure that we don't actually breach boundaries, we don't disrespect people in any way or any form or fashion. So in conclusion, I would like to say that the ability to identify toxic organizations, work environment leaders is critical for success, especially now more than ever, with the great resignation and silent quitting. Now, we've known about these things, not so much a great resignation because we have not experienced it like what happened in Europe and the US, but silent quitting. We've seen that for years. I mean, it's called work to rule, it's called go slow in our context. But what you find is that if people are in these kind of environments, they withdraw, they don't give up themselves anymore. So that is why it's important to identify it and address it, because it's critical to the success of your organization. You would find people being present, but they're not really present. You would find people using every single category of leave that they could possibly use because they don't want to be there, right? So understand the effects, pay attention to the signs of it as well, to the behaviors of people around you as well. Recognize methods for addressing and dealing with toxic individuals, and certainly protect your organization's culture. And again, bear in mind what shapes culture. It's not only words on paper that we document things, but it's the actions that we allow to continue in our respective organizations, is what we permit, is what we accept. So whether we accept someone cursing out someone in a WhatsApp chat, or someone cursing out someone in a boardroom meeting, or insulting the person, or not allowing them to finish their statement or what they were saying, always interrupting and all of that, all those things contribute to an unhealthy work environment where people wouldn't produce at their maximum capacity. And we should not tolerate things like that altogether. So that brings me to the end of my very brief presentation in terms of just introducing you a little bit to the concept of toxic behaviors. And really and truly, an organization such as this institution, one that is so well respected, that is so global, that has such an international appeal, should never be accused of encouraging toxic behaviors altogether, toxic people. It shouldn't be a word associated with an institution such as Rotary. So if there are any signs of it, any behaviors that were described this evening that you could identify as occurring, let's all work together to ensure that that changes from hence on, change it. And I trust that the presentation was useful to all of you. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Cavelle. You've touched on some really significant points in terms of identifying, clarifying, and certainly dealing with the consequences of if you don't do anything about it. But one of the things that is, it's a very tricky thing in the Caribbean, as you know, and I'm happy to see quite a few Rotaractors on the call this evening, because a lot of young people do not know or can't decipher what is inappropriate and what is appropriate. So, my question to you before I go into the chat box is what kind of advice would you give to a young person? Rotary International do have lots of guidelines. Over the years, they've been putting in a lot of guidelines when it comes to youth. But yet it is difficult for a young person who is probably ambitious, someone who wants to aspire upwards in Rotary ultimately. What advice would you give to them, with the fear of wanting to report, but the fear of retaliation?
Yeah, and that's a real thing. You see it even in organizations where you want to climb the corporate ladder, so to speak. And in this case, you want to be elevated in the club, even having ambitions of being, district governor and all of that, right? Someone could have those aspirations. And the fear of, if I report this person who is so beloved, who was a past PG or whatever titles that you all have, I'm not familiar with all, right? But there's that natural fear. And sometimes they need someone to mentor and guide and help that person navigate, you know. And that's why mentorship is so critical in institutions such as yours, where you have young Rotaracs now wanting to learn and navigate through the system, and have someone you can trust and talk to and share the experience, who may actually intervene on your behalf, you know, who could come with you and say, here, what? This is the behavior that, describe the behavior and try to assist you with addressing the issue with that person before it becomes a documented issue, before you have the formal reporting lines, you know. And sometimes why I say have someone who mentors you or who you can trust is because on your own, confronting a very powerful person is very intimidating. But if you have someone you could trust who could do it with you, where you could say, here, what? I want to speak with this person on this behavior. Can you accompany me? And have that session. And depending on how that person responds, will allow you now, or at least will help you to determine what next in terms of what other steps you should take. Because I'm certain there's a disciplinary element to Rotary where members could be brought forward for their conduct and possibly be even expelled from the organization because of their conduct as well too. So before we get to the formal channels, let us try and resolve the issues. And if it cannot be resolved, then do that. And yes, you may think it may delay you, but at the end of the day is what you would be willing to accept, because the person who is doing that, 99% of the time they've done it to somebody else, or they will do it to somebody else. So therefore, one person being brave enough to stand up may result in others who've experienced it before standing up to, and in strength in numbers, now you may be able to address an issue and make the change. Outside of that, if it's not being addressed, I would say move to another club or to another district. Right? You know, if a club is not, it's just like when you have to resign, an organization is not addressing the issue, resign. That's the most you could do. But that is unfair, because at the end of the day, you impact in my progress. So I do hope and trust that you all have systems in place to address the conduct of members.
Yeah, right. Thanks. Yeah, I can, that's very close to my heart. I want to get into it, but it is very close to my heart. All right, we do have one question in the chat box. It does seem that your presentation was pellucidly clear. We didn't have a lot of questions. In a Rotary setting, and this is coming from AB, members can become very comfortable with each other. This comfort can sometimes create fuzziness as to what constitutes toxic behavior. How can members handle such comfort behavior without offending other members? And, you know, in Rotary, you know, not a lot of persons like to be hugged, and that is something that everybody sees you and, you know, want to hug you. And well, I think COVID helped to put that distance between individuals, but COVID is going away, and I think I'm seeing the hugs coming back as well. So if you can address this question.
Well, let us bear in mind the definition, for example, of harassment, and it must be offensive to the person, right? So it's how the person receives the action. So if someone is actually quite comfortable, this discomfort that we're talking about, with hugging, kissing on the cheek, all these different things, then that is acceptable to that individual. But you may find somebody else will not be comfortable with the hugging and the kissing, just like you've shared, Liz, and therefore is respecting boundaries and how people feel about these things as well. And because as humans you're dealing with, and we all have that propensity for, I mean, social interaction is just part of who we are. It's for us to determine whether as a rule you want to regulate it in such a rigid manner, or if people set their own boundaries to what is accepted or not and express it. And we should be okay with when someone expresses that, hey, what, I'm not comfortable with the hugging or whatever, so that be respected and we move on from it, rather than being offended by the fact that that person said that. So it's generally having a code in terms of general acceptable standards of behavior, a code of conduct, and then members defining for themselves what they will accept or not. So that's a tricky thing with it, because somebody might be very comfortable with the jokes too, you know, and they're laughing and everything, and it's okay. And then they crack the same joke with somebody else and they're offended by it. So it's establishing the ground rules and knowing for yourself what is acceptable and what isn't. And that is why communication is so important. So that if you are offended, it should be an environment that fosters communication, that allows people to express that as well, so we can adjust our behaviors accordingly. Because not everybody might be offended by a joke or two, you know? That's just the reality as well, because it's so individualized. You know, some of us good with it and we're down with the boys, as the case may be, and others, they're just not for that. So it's very individualistic. I mean, I don't want to say individualistic, but it's about what your personal boundaries and what you would accept as an individual.
All right, thank you for that question. Lisa, could you unmute Kamala? I see she has her hands up, and then there's another question in the chat.
Thanks.
You're unmuted. You're unmuted, Kamala.
Yeah, I was able to unmute myself, so thank you very much. Cavelle, let me congratulate you. This was such a really, really great presentation. Very, very stimulating and so appropriate for us as well. Because something that I wanted to ask you about, given the fact that our culture in the region is one that is so characterized by picking, where picking is sometimes encouraged.
Mm-hmm.
How do we create that kind of space that you just spoke about that would allow persons who feel uncomfortable to know how to be able to express that, given that this is something that everyone else considers to be normal and that you should be okay with it?
So the orientation into the organization will be critical to give people a realistic introduction into what to expect, so they can determine whether or not they would want to be a part of that. I think that is key. So it's similar when I hire, when we recruit, and that interview process. So I know there's a process for joining Rotary. I'm certain of it as well. The interview is an understanding of, we both interviewing each other. So based on how you conduct yourself, if I am being interviewed by you for a job, I'm also assessing you and whether or not I would want to be a part of your organization, just based on how you treat me at that stage and throughout the process as well. So when you're recruiting new members, it's important to give them an honest introduction into the institution, a realistic understanding of what to expect, the behaviors, because each club, as you move district to district, will be different, right? That's a fact as well. In the same country, you would have multiple clubs that operate very different from each other because of the people that make up the club, right? So that orientation is important. Once they've agreed to join, give them that introduction. Here, what we crack a lot of jokes here. Long as the jokes, you see, there are things under law, under Equal Opportunities Act and all these different things. So you know, things that are LGBTQ related, jokes about your gender, about race and all of that, those things should not be accepted, period. But there are others that, you know, we like to just throw a little peek on here or there. Let them know that this is how we operate. I might crack a little stale joke or two, right? But the minute it threads on infringing people's rights, or that could be accused, you could be accused of discrimination or on not providing equal opportunities and all of that, that is where the lines become blurred and it becomes very offensive. So you shouldn't make fun of people's religion or their or how they speak, because they're from a rural community versus coming from a city area, an urban area, you know. So, you know, country girl come to tongue. And they used to say these things long time, right? Country girl come to tongue and wherever else. And we will know of it and laugh, kia. And then the next generation coming up would never appreciate that, I'm telling you. In fact, political correctness now is taking us into a different world, you know, where most things are offensive to a number of people. So it's what culture you are trying to create in your club and what are your rules. So if I am joining your institution and these are your rules, it's up to me to say whether I want to be a part of it or not, but tell me up front. So I will know here and this ain't for me, you know. Or I would say, yes, I have no problem with it. I have no problem if you're all drinking alcohol. I have no problem if we have the occasional lime down the islands or wherever you all go. but say it up front so that, you know, it doesn't become an issue for the club as well. So a realistic introduction to the club will help. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Cavelle. Usually we like to keep our members to the 1 hour. And there's one last question I'd like you to, Kimberly has her hands raised, but just last question. And then we can quickly go to Kimberly very briefly. If the person who is raising the awareness of toxic behavior is toxic themselves, how do we deal with such?
So it's pot calling the kettle black, as we would say. Oh boy. Oh, that is so funny. And often, again, the narcissistic personality is that's tied to that, where they often flip it, you know, and they themselves doing it and accusing somebody else of doing it as well. And this is where, again, whatever procedures you have for addressing these matters will step in. When individual come in and investigates and, you know, outlines and have their report, it have to have some official, you'll have to have some kind of official way to investigate it. So it's not only a matter of me telling Kamla, for example, Kamla X, Y, and Z, and we having that one-on-one conversation versus me reporting Kamla. When I myself do the same thing to her, then the investigation will unearth all those things as well that will allow the club to come to a conclusion. So it has to be treated in a very formal way, especially if it's formally reported as well.
All right, thank you. Kimberly, you want to ask your questions quickly as we close down?
Yes, good evening, DG Leslie, past DG Sonia, AG Cox, Rotarians, Rotaractors, and guests. Very good presentation. I'm happy I was able to join because being a past president or even in a leadership position right now, you find that a lot of persons may have behavior that may come off as toxic. So my question to you, Cavelle, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, how does a leader recognize, being a leader, how do you recognize that somebody, you know, may have a toxic behavior? Is there certain traits that you may see? And because usually what I found that usually persons that have toxic behavior, they make persons feel defensive. So when you're trying to address something, they make you appear as though you're being defensive, when really and truly you're trying to highlight or bring to them that, you know, your behavior approach to something may not be the best. So how do you deal with that, or how do you recognize so that you're not more or less imposing what you think is right on them? Thank you.
So that's, it comes back again to the code in terms of what the club, because the minute you have rules centered around an individual, that in itself causes problems. You don't ever want to set up an organization or an institution around a person, but the institution or the organization have to frame out what they want to establish for themselves as a code. And that is what will be the guiding force going forward. Not how the leader feels or how any individual feels, but what the code says in terms of what is acceptable or not. We've seen often, especially in the Caribbean, where institutions, where individuals actually become the institution or take on a life that the individual and the institution is actually like one. That is very unhealthy and in itself toxic, right? The minute that person find themselves in a situation, the whole brand is impacted. I mean, you see it time and time again. So the Rotary Club should never want to be like that, but certainly have rules, and it's an international organization, so it should have rules that are relevant to the country that the Rotary is operating in, because as you move from country to country, culture differs, right? And rules that are relevant for the function of the section. I forget, I'm not familiar with all the terminology in the club, but I know right in Trinidad and Tobago, there are different clubs. So even for a company now, so if we move away from Rotary Club and we look at company, now a family business, where I'm saying the organization shouldn't center around the leader. It's very difficult in a family type business or family run business now, where everything would center around the owner of the business and the culture of that organization and the behaviors, everything is centered around that individual. And Kimberly, in a family owned, managed and operated business, it's very difficult to have any kind of change altogether. And that's why sometimes you have to make the decision to leave and move on, because it is going to be centered around the leader, because it's there, it was their equity, everything that set up this business. So most of the time they'll tell you, you can't come and tell me how to run my business, especially leaders of a particular generation, right? New leaders are a little bit different now. So that in itself is a distinction. But in other organizations, publicly traded, state entities, etc., you try to break that, where the leader becomes the organization and decisions or the standards or everything is set based on that person. So this is where, again, policies, procedures, codes come in to establish what we accept, full stop.
All right. Thank you so much, Cavelle. No doubt a very inspiring, and I think we could go on and on and on. A very inspiring topic that really triggers quite a few questions. But thank you so much for your presentation. I think it was really relevant, very appropriate, and it's directly linked with our DEI that our Rotary International focuses on and has a real close focus on right now: diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're a very busy person, multi-talented and multifaceted and all of those things. But thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening. Again, thank you, Cavelle, and thank you all for participating in tonight's activity. And to close, I'd like to ask DG Leslie to close off the session. And DG Sonia, PDG Sonia keeps saying DG still. Do you have anything else you wanted to add?
Just that it was all that I thought and more. Cavelle really covered the topics, and I think we certainly had a good ear. I mean, we hear this all the time, but it's always good to hear it again and again, because we need to keep it in the front of our minds, particularly for us as Rotarians, how we go about our business with our colleagues and our youth members. Be respectful. So I'm super happy with tonight's session, but the DG for sure will round us up.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Sonia. DG, over to you to close our session.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, the IPDG, for your comments there. Very much appreciated. Indeed, very inspirational, you know, very relevant to us as Rotarians, because as Sonia said, you know, this relates directly to one of our priorities this year, that of DEI. That is something we are all embracing as members of Rotary, and this topic is so relevant. So, St-Omer, I really want to thank you so much for the time you spent with us this evening. It has been worthwhile. It has been inspirational, very informative. Everybody would have great takeaways from this presentation, and it can really make us better Rotarians if we really focus on how we uncover toxic behavior, because it is in our Rotary manuscripts. We just have to look for it, and we find there's a lot of information there. So it's something we must take on board as Rotarians, take it to heart, and really do uncover the possible toxic behaviors that can arise. So thank you so much, Ms. St-Omer, for your presentation. It's very appreciated. The membership, we were over 92 persons. That tells you the sort of impact that you had this evening. Persons we reached out to, really meaningful. So on behalf of our District 70 training team, I thank you so much for your presentation, and I want to thank all participants. Our PDG, so good to see you all on board, supporting us all the way, all our members and visitors from near and afar. I do hope you had a very fulfilling evening with the presentation from St-Omer. So thank you all so much. Have a good evening.
All right, thanks, DG. Just to remind Rotarians, office hours part 2 is on Saturday, starting at 10 o'clock. It's a great opportunity, especially for Rotaractors and young Rotarians, young in age as well as tenure in Rotary, to visit between 10 and 12, visit and go room to room to ask questions. There are going to be senior Rotarians, there are going to be leadership from the district in each room. So you're open to ask questions and clarify any issues you may wish to hear about, to know more about. So please join us on Saturday for office hours part 2. Thank you all and have a good evening.